In 1986, life for the Andrews family was turned completely upside down. The two teenage sisters, Annie and Jessica, suddenly and tragically lost their mother to cancer. Her death was fairly abrupt, and it caught everyone by surprise, leaving a huge hole in the family. After she was gone, Annie and Jessica lived full-time with their father, Brian. Now, Brian had always been a hard worker, but with the loss of his wife, he had to take on even more hours just to make ends meet and provide for his two daughters. The general has intensive. He was a single father now, and the weight of that was immense. For Annie and Jessica, the loss was devastating. They had been incredibly close with their mom, and now, with their dad gone at work so often, the house felt quiet and empty. The two sisters were left alone a lot, just them and their thoughts, and all they could think about was how much they missed their mother. The grief was a constant, heavy presence in the house. So one night, while Brian was out on a late shift, the girls came up with an idea. They decided they would try to use a Ouija board to contact their mom. They would later admit they didn't really expect anything to happen, but they were just so desperate for some kind of connection, any sign that she was still with them. They went down into the basement and found the old board game. They set it up, but they didn't really do any research on how a seance was supposed to work. They just sat down, put their hands on the planchette, and started asking simple questions. They asked if their mother was there. They asked if she could give them a sign. For a couple of hours, they sat there in the quiet basement, focusing all their energy on their mom. And of course, nothing really happened. The planchette didn't move on its own. There were no strange noises or flickering lights. Eventually, they decided to put the board away. But in a way, the whole experience was cathartic for them. It gave them a chance to just sit and think about their mom, to talk to her, and to imagine that maybe, just maybe, she could hear them. Even if it was just in their heads, it made them feel closer to her for a little while. So, feeling a bit better, they put the Ouija board away and went back upstairs. They had a quiet rest of the evening and eventually decided to just head to bed. Their father still wasn't home, but this was normal. They were used to it. Annie and Jessica went to their separate bedrooms, and as they were lying there in the dark trying to fall asleep, they both started to hear something. It was a faint tapping sound. At first, they probably thought they were imagining it. But the sound was persistent. It seemed to be coming from inside the walls. Jessica got up and quietly went into Annie's room. She whispered, asking if Annie heard the tapping too. And Annie said yes, she did. They sat there together, listening intently. The house would fall silent, and then it would start again. A soft, rhythmic tapping from somewhere deep within the structure of the house. They had never heard anything like it before. Now, these two girls were grieving deeply. Their minds immediately went back to the seance they had just performed. Could it be? Was this the sign they had asked for? They wanted to believe it so badly, they started whispering to each other that it must be their mom. She was trying to get in touch with them. The seance must have actually worked. And so, what started as a potentially scary sound turned into something hopeful. They started asking questions out loud into the empty room. They asked, "Mom, are you here with us right now?" They asked if she could show herself, if she was okay, if she was watching over them. It was a strange mix of fear and comfort. The idea of a spirit in their house was unsettling, but the thought that it was their mother's spirit there to look after them was deeply reassuring. When their father, Brian, finally got home from work that night, the tapping had stopped. The girls rushed to tell him what happened. They were excited, not scared. They told him about the Ouija board and then about the tapping sounds in the walls, convinced it was their mom. Brian was exhausted. He'd worked a long day, and he was still processing his own grief over losing his wife. He listened to his daughters, and his heart broke for them. He was sure they were just making it up, a product of their grief and their desire to have their mother back. He thought, they're struggling, they miss their mom so much, and this is how it's coming out. That first night, he even considered getting them into some kind of therapy or grief counseling. Not because he was angry, but because he was worried. He saw this as a clear sign that they weren't coping well. But for now, he just tried to calm them down. He told them, "Look, girls, just go back to bed. I'm sure she's looking out for all of us." He didn't want to dismiss their feelings entirely, but he also didn't want to encourage what he saw as a fantasy. So, the girls went back to their rooms, and Brian didn't think too much more of it that night. He was just a tired, grieving father worried about his kids. But the tapping didn't stop. Over the next several days, it continued, and it actually started to get more frequent. It got so persistent that it began to disturb the girls' sleep. Night after night, they would lie awake, listening to the tapping inside the walls. And every time they would get scared and call for their father to come check on it, the moment he would step into the room, the tapping would stop. It was maddening for them. It made them feel like they were going crazy. Then, other strange things started to happen. When the family would leave the house for the day, for school or work, they would come back to find things out of place. It was always small things, subtle changes. A piece of furniture would be moved just slightly from its original position. Some of the silverware in the kitchen drawer would be rearranged. Little objects on shelves would be shifted around. It was just enough to be noticeable, to create a feeling that someone or something had been there while they were gone. Of course, Annie and Jessica were convinced it was the spirit of their mother. But Brian was having none of it. He sat them down and told them firmly that this had to stop. He said, "Guys, I know this is you. I know how much you miss your mom, and I know you want this to be real. You want her to be here with us, but she's not. You have to stop moving the furniture around. This whole ghost thing is not healthy." He warned them that if it continued, he was going to insist they start seeing a grief counselor. For the girls, this was a terrible blow. They were adamant that it wasn't them. They were genuinely scared now. And the fact that their own father didn't believe them made them feel completely alone. The initial comfort they had felt, the belief that it was their mother, was starting to fade. This didn't feel like something their mom would do. Moving things around, playing games, trying to scare them, it felt more sinister. They started to think that maybe when they used that Ouija board, they had let something else in. Something evil. And now it was in their house, terrorizing them, and there was nothing they could do because the one person who was supposed to protect them thought they were making it all up. One evening in January of 1987, a few weeks into this strange ordeal, the girls were together in the front room of the house, and they started to hear the tapping sounds again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the walls around them. It sounded like it was coming from the basement. After weeks of being scared and feeling helpless, something inside them snapped. They felt a sudden surge of confidence, or maybe just desperation. They decided they were going to go down there and confront whatever this thing was. Their father wasn't home to help, and he wouldn't believe them anyway. They had to face this on their own. So they took a deep breath and headed for the basement stairs. As they went down, the tapping stopped. The basement was quiet and still. They looked around, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. They couldn't find any source for the noise. Feeling a little bit foolish, like they were on a ghost hunt that had led nowhere, they turned to go back upstairs. But as they did, they saw it. Scrawled on the basement wall in what looked like red paint or marker were the words, "Come find me. I'm in your closet." They froze. This was different. This was terrifying. It was no longer just tapping or moved furniture. This was a direct message. It was confirmation that something was actively messing with them, taunting them. It wasn't their mother. This felt like a threat. The girls didn't hesitate. They screamed and ran out of the basement, out of the house, and straight next door to their neighbors. They pounded on the door, hysterical, and told their neighbors that something weird was happening in their house. They tried to explain about the writing on the wall, but they were probably not making much sense. The neighbors, seeing how genuinely terrified they were, let them in and told them to just wait there until their father got home. A little while later, they saw Brian's car pull into the driveway. They ran out and flagged him down, and he came over to the neighbor's house. The neighbor pulled Brian aside and explained what had happened, that the girls had come over in a complete panic. Annie and Jessica then told their dad that there was writing on the wall in the basement. Brian's first reaction was frustration. This was just too much. He thought now they're defacing the property to keep this fantasy going. For him, this was the line. It had gone from a coping mechanism to something totally unhealthy. Still, he went over to the house with them to see for himself. He went down into the basement, and there it was, just as they had described. Red writing on the wall. But instead of being scared, he was just angry at his daughters. He immediately ordered them to start grief counseling. This was no longer a suggestion, it was a demand. And so they began seeing a therapist. And for a while, it seemed to work. For several weeks after that incident, the house was completely silent. There was no tapping. Nothing was ever out of place. It was almost like whatever had been haunting them had just given up and left. Then, one night, Brian was working late again and the girls were home alone. They were sitting together in the front room, enjoying the peace and quiet they had finally gotten back. And then, they heard it. The tapping. It was back. They got up and slowly, cautiously made their way through the house, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It led them to Annie's bedroom. When they opened the door and looked inside, their hearts sank. Written on her bedroom wall were new words. I'm back. Find me if you can. It was happening all over again. They did the only thing they could think to do. They ran. They fled the house and went straight back to the same neighbor's house. They explained that it had happened again, begging the neighbor to believe them. The neighbor let them stay, and they all waited for Brian to come home. When he arrived, the same scene played out. He was flagged down and brought over to the neighbors. This time, when he heard the story, Brian was furious. He confronted the girls, saying, I put you in counseling. I told you to stop doing this. This is not okay. He was at his wit's end. He then told the girls and the neighbor to stay right where they were. He was going to go into that house himself and search it from top to bottom. He was going to prove to them, once and for all, that there was nothing to be afraid of. So he marched back over to his own house, unlocked the front door, and stepped inside. And he stopped dead in his tracks. The house was in total disarray. It looked like it had been completely ransacked. Furniture was overturned, drawers were pulled out, things were thrown everywhere. And his first thought was, the girls didn't do this. Someone else had been in his house. Suddenly, he was on edge. The anger was gone, replaced by a cold fear. He walked cautiously through the trashed rooms, listening for any sound, but it was silent. He made his way upstairs to Annie's bedroom. He saw the writing on the wall, just as they had described. And then he looked towards the closet, and he saw a man standing there. The man was wearing women's clothes. In fact, they were his dead wife's clothes. He was also wearing a wig and carrying a small hatchet. This figure, this man in a dress, was just standing in the closet, staring at Brian. Brian was completely startled. For a second, he was just frozen. Then, the man in the dress started running. He charged out of the closet, and Brian, reacting on instinct, tried to grab him to fight him, but the man was fast and managed to push past Brian and run out of the room. Brian, shaken but now filled with adrenaline, started chasing after him. But the guy was quick. By the time Brian got downstairs, the man was gone. He searched the house frantically, but there was no sign of him. Realizing the man had a hatchet, Brian decided the safest thing to do was get out. He ran out of the house back to his neighbors and yelled for them to call 911. There was an intruder. He stayed with his daughters while the police arrived. They went into the house and conducted a thorough search. They looked everywhere, but they couldn't find anyone. They told Brian that they were sure someone had been there based on his very convincing story and the state of the house, but the person was long gone now. There wasn't much they could do other than advise him not to stay there that night. They said they would keep an eye on the house, do some patrols, but until the intruder was caught, it wasn't safe for the family to be there. And so, the family was left with no answers. Who was that person? How did he get in? And more importantly, how did he get away? Brian was racking his brain. A man in a dress carrying a hatchet is a pretty distinctive sight. How could he just vanish into the neighborhood without anyone seeing him? For the next 2 weeks, Brian and his daughters stayed with relatives. It was a horrible, traumatizing time. Brian was consumed with guilt. He felt like a terrible father. He had left his girls alone night after night in a house with some crazy person living inside of it. He had never believed them. He kept thinking about what could have happened and how it would have been all his fault. The girls were equally traumatized. They now knew that for weeks they had been interacting with a real, dangerous person who was hiding in their home, a person with an axe. But after 2 weeks, living with relatives in a cramped space was getting difficult. And at this point, they reasoned that whoever that man was, he must be long gone. The police were watching the house. They decided it was time to go home. They would get a new security system, be more careful, but they had to get back to their lives. So, they packed up their things and headed back. As Brian was driving up his own street, he looked at his house, and he noticed something odd. There was a light on in one of the second-floor windows. He thought that was strange. He knew the police were patrolling the neighborhood, but he didn't think they were actually inside his house. As he was looking up at that window, about to pull into his driveway, he saw him. The man in the dress. He walked right past the window, clear as day. Brian slammed on the brakes. He immediately grabbed his daughters, made sure they were safe, and called the police again. This time, he knew the man was still inside. Police were there in seconds. They surrounded the house completely. There was no way anyone was getting out this time. With the house completely surrounded, the police finally made their entry. No one had been inside that house since Brian and the girls had left 2 weeks prior. They had locked it up tight. When the officers opened the front door, they were met with a bizarre and disturbing scene. Not only was all the furniture flipped upside down and moved all over the place again, but there were pennies glued to the ceiling, hundreds of them just stuck up there. And there was red writing everywhere on all the walls in strange, cryptic messages. The police searched the entire house again, top to bottom. But just like before, they didn't find anyone. They were about to conclude that the person had somehow slipped away again, but one of the officers who was searching the basement noticed something. He saw a small piece of wood that looked like it was covering a crawl space behind the washer and dryer. He found that he could move the appliances aside fairly easily. Behind them was a board. When he pulled the board away, it revealed the entrance to a dark, narrow crawl space. Inside this crawl space, the police made a shocking discovery. Someone had burrowed tunnels through the insulation, creating a hidden network that ran throughout the entire house inside the walls. There were small peepholes drilled into the walls in almost every room, allowing whoever was in there to look out and see everything that was going on. And as they followed this intricate maze of tunnels, they found him. Hiding deep within the walls of the house was Danny LaPlante. It turns out Danny was a teenager who had briefly dated Annie. After they had broken up, he had secretly snuck into their house and had been living in their walls for months. He had been listening to every conversation. He heard them talking about their mother's passing. He watched them through the peepholes as they performed the seance with the Ouija board. And he used all of that information to orchestrate the entire haunting. He was the one tapping on the walls. he was the one writing messages with ketchup. He would sneak out at night when they were asleep or when the house was empty to move the furniture around, and then he would slip back into his hiding spot. After Danny LaPlante was pulled out of the crawl space, he was arrested and placed in a juvenile detention center. But the story doesn't end there. Later, in 1987, after he was released, for reasons that nobody really understands, Danny broke into another family's home. And this time, he murdered almost the entire family in cold blood. The idea of someone living in your walls for months is horrifying enough. But to know that it was a psychopath like Danny LaPlante takes it to another level. That final scene, when the police go in and find the pennies glued to the ceiling and the writing everywhere before finding him in that hidden crawl space, it's like something straight out of a horror movie. It's so bizarre, it almost doesn't seem real. But it was. And you just have to think about the trauma that the Andrews family went through. Not just the loss of their mother, but then this terrifying ordeal and the horrifying realization of what could have happened to them. They were living with a future murderer and they never even knew it. It's a kind of deep-seated trauma that you can only hope they were somehow able to recover from. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. This is a story about a brilliant young man who had millions of dollars in the bank, but was so completely consumed by a single terrifying thought that he ended up building a literal maze of death right beneath his own home. And because of his actions, a young 19-year-old man who trusted him with his life would find himself trapped in a pitch-black nightmare with absolutely no way out. To understand how this tragedy happened, we have to go back to the beginning of the story of Daniel Beckwith. Daniel was born in 1,991 inches, Bethesda, Maryland, which is a very quiet and wealthy suburb just outside of Washington, D.C. Daniel was the only child of two highly eccentric and incredibly intelligent parents named Linda and David. His father, David, had a doctoral degree and was a very accomplished opera singer who had actually performed at the White House. His mother, Linda, was a brilliant lawyer who had graduated from the prestigious Columbia Law School and had worked as a high-level government attorney. But Linda eventually decided that the legal profession was far too corrupt for her liking, so she gave it all up to become an opera singer just like her husband. When Daniel was just a toddler, his parents realized that he was not like other children. He taught himself how to read before he was even 3 years old. He had an incredibly high intellect, and his mother became fiercely protective of him. She decided that the public school system was simply not advanced enough to teach her brilliant son, so she chose to homeschool him. By the time Daniel was 5 years old, he was reading thick classic novels, and shortly after that, he figured out how to completely dismantle and reprogram his video game systems. But despite his massive intelligence, Daniel had a very lonely and isolated childhood. He was almost never allowed to go outside and play with the other children in the neighborhood. On the rare occasions that he was permitted to step outside, his parents would hover over him the entire time, watching his every move. And almost nobody from the neighborhood was ever allowed to come inside the Beckwith house. This was because Daniel's parents were severe hoarders. If you stepped through the front door of that house, you would immediately run into towering stacks of old papers, books, rotting cardboard boxes, and discarded food containers. Then, in the year 2000, when Daniel was 9 years old, his father was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. This meant his mother had to take care of both her ailing husband and her young son, and under the immense stress, her eccentric behavior grew much worse. She became completely obsessed with protecting their property. If a neighbor walked even slightly too close to her lawn, Linda would run out of the front door and scream at them until they ran away. But despite how strange they were, anyone who knew the Beckwith family could tell that Linda and David absolutely adored their son. They just could not give him any personal space. One neighbor recalled seeing the family out trick-or-treating for Halloween, and even though Daniel was a teenager by then, all three of them were wearing matching giant hamster outfits. Daniel loved his parents, but as he grew older, he realized how smothering they really were. He wanted to connect with people his own age, so he turned to the internet. He found a community on an anonymous online forum called 4chan. On this forum, Daniel could pretend to be whoever he wanted. He created a tough guy persona, bragging to other users about how he had finished high school by age 15 and spent his free time building explosives in his backyard. But occasionally, Daniel would let his guard down and talk about a deep, paralyzing fear that occupied his thoughts at all times. This was his extreme fear of death. In 2010, it looked like Daniel's isolation might finally end. He enrolled at the University of Illinois to study computer science and electrical engineering. His parents dropped him off at the train station, and as the train pulled away, Daniel felt a massive wave of relief. He felt like he was finally free. But just a few months into his first semester, he received terrible news. His mother had been diagnosed with cancer. She had hidden her illness from everyone, including Daniel, and had refused to see a doctor. By the time Daniel rushed back home, she was in terrible shape, and she passed away just 2 weeks later. Only 3 people showed up to her funeral. Daniel stood there in mismatched clothes and pants that were far too short, looking completely dazed as he gave her eulogy, telling the small crowd that he felt totally lost. After he went back to college, his father's health began to decline rapidly, and Daniel had to place him into an assisted living facility. Living alone in his college apartment, Daniel was completely consumed by grief and a massive escalation of his fear of death. He had seen his mother die suddenly, and now he was watching his father slowly wither away. He went back onto the online forums and talked about taking a defensive position against his own mortality. To do this, Daniel researched the most common causes of death for young men his age. When he saw that car accidents were a leading cause, he went out and reinforced all the doors of his car with heavy Kevlar plates, and whenever he drove the car, he wore a thick, bulletproof Kevlar vest because he believed it would protect his internal organs from blunt force trauma in a crash. He also knew that cancer was a major killer, so he personally went to a doctor and demanded that every single mole on his body be surgically removed as a preventative measure. But the thing that Daniel feared most was not a car accident or a disease. He became absolutely convinced that a nuclear attack on the United States was imminent. He believed the only way to survive was to build a proper underground fallout shelter. Fortunately for him, his mother had left him a multi-million-dollar trust fund, so he had the money to do whatever he wanted. He put his college studies on hold, returned to his childhood home in Bethesda, went down into the basement, and began to dig a massive hole right in the center of the concrete floor. Over the next 2 years, Daniel split his time between his college classes and his secret project in Bethesda. He hired various contractors to come to his home and dig a massive, sprawling labyrinth of tunnels deep beneath his property. But in 2012, both his schoolwork and his tunnel digging came to a sudden halt because of his own bizarre behavior. Professors at his university began to report that someone was sneaking into their offices at night, hacking into their computers, and sending highly inappropriate and embarrassing emails to their entire contact lists of students and faculty. After sending the emails, the hacker would use superglue to seal the professor's office doors shut so they could not get inside the next morning. The university police department investigated the strange vandalism for months. Eventually, several students pointed them toward Daniel, noting that he was a genius-level hacker who had recently spoken at a major cybersecurity conference. A detective went to Daniel's apartment to talk to him, but Daniel did not answer the door. As the detective was standing in the hallway, he noticed a package sitting on the welcome mat. It was addressed to a person named S. Loomis D. Twyler. The detective suspected this might be an alias for Daniel, so he went back to the station and ran the name through their databases. It turned out that this alias was connected to an online profile that had recently been bragging about breaking into university offices and hacking the professors. With this information, the police secured a search warrant for Daniel's apartment. When officers entered the apartment using a spare key, they were met with a scene of absolute chaos. The apartment was packed with towering piles of papers, books, computer wires, trash, and old food boxes. A dirty mattress with no sheets sat right in the middle of the room. On top of a mini fridge in the corner, detectives found Daniel's laptop. It was open and unlocked. The officers cloned his hard drive right then and there, and the digital evidence they recovered proved beyond a doubt that Daniel was indeed the hacker. Daniel was arrested and charged with multiple serious felonies, but right before his trial, his lawyers managed to secure a plea deal. Daniel immediately went onto the website Reddit and bragged to online users that he fully expected the state governor to step in and pardon him because he had donated a large sum of money to the governor's campaign, but that pardon never came. Fortunately for Daniel, the judge gave him a very light sentence. He was ordered to pay $23,000 in restitution to the university and was placed on 2 years of probation. But Daniel was expelled from the university, so he moved back into his childhood home in Bethesda to live alone. With no school to worry about, he poured all of his energy into building his underground bunker. He hired specialized contractors to expand the tunnels, digging deep into the earth and branching out in multiple directions, eventually crossing well past his own property lines. To fund his ongoing project, Daniel turned his attention to trading Bitcoin. Because of his mathematical brilliance, he became incredibly good at day trading cryptocurrency. Within a short period of time, he made millions of dollars. By 2015, his probation had ended and his massive underground bunker was mostly complete. He spent less time trading and more time sitting inside his bunker, live streaming on a popular website called Blab. During these live streams, Daniel talked at length about his investment strategies and how he had accumulated his fortune. But he was deeply paranoid about anyone discovering his real identity or his location. Whenever he went live, he wore a large, heavy fire protection hood that completely covered his head and face, and he used a voice changer to mask his voice. He went by the online username 3-Alarm Lamp Scooter. Among his small but very loyal group of followers was a 19-year-old young man named Askia Kafra. Askia lived in a pleasant, middle-class neighborhood only 15 minutes away from Daniel's house, but he had no idea they were neighbors. Daniel always claimed that he lived in a secret underground bunker somewhere deep in the state of Virginia. Askia completely idolized this mysterious online millionaire. Askia was the son of hardworking immigrants from Trinidad, and he desperately wanted to be successful and wealthy. When Askia turned 18, he had received a $100,000 financial settlement from a childhood lead poisoning lawsuit. For a brief moment, he got a taste of what it was like to be rich. But he was young and naive, and he quickly blew through all of the money on expensive dinners, designer clothes, and renting high-end sports cars like Mercedes and BMWs. Once the money was completely gone, Askia was determined to get it all back. He came up with a business plan to build a new smartphone app called Equity Shark. The app was designed to be a crowdfunding platform that would allow average people to invest small amounts of money into promising new startup companies. Askia was convinced that this app was going to make him a billionaire. But he had no money left to actually build the app. He and his business partner applied for a $100,000 grant for young entrepreneurs who had dropped out of college, which Askia had recently done. Askia was highly confident they would get the grant, but he still had many of the blind spots of a young man learning how to navigate the adult world. His biggest weakness was that he was incredibly trusting, and he was quick to believe anyone who seemed successful. It was during this time that Askia found Daniel's live streams on Blab. He was amazed by this wealthy figure who called himself Three-Alarm Lamp Scooter. When Daniel mentioned to his viewers that he was looking to make some new business investments, Askia saw his chance. He reached out to Daniel and asked if he and his partner could pitch their app, Equity Shark, to him. Daniel agreed. In June of 2016, Askia and his partner went to a local hookah bar to meet this mysterious investor. They had no idea what he actually looked like because he always wore the fire protection hood online. But as soon as Daniel walked through the door of the bar, they knew it was him. Daniel was wearing an incredibly bulky, oversized shirt, and it was obvious to everyone in the room that he was wearing a heavy bulletproof vest underneath it. Askia and his partner simply overlooked this strange behavior, assuming it was just another one of the eccentricities of a tech genius. They sat down and pitched Equity Shark to Daniel. They explained that their success rested on securing the $100,000 grant, which they were absolutely certain they would receive. Daniel was highly impressed by their pitch, and he agreed to invest $5,000 of his own money into their company. But he made them sign an agreement stating that they had to pay him back using the grant money, and if they did not get the grant, they would have to find another way to repay him. Askia was thrilled. He felt that getting the grant was a sure thing, so there was absolutely no risk in taking Daniel's money. Shortly after securing the $5,000, the program manager for the grant called Askia and told him that his company had made it to the second round. They needed to fly out to San Francisco to pitch their idea in person. Askia and his partner were incredibly excited. They immediately called Daniel to tell him the good news, and then they booked their flights. But in their excitement and lack of travel experience, they made a massive mistake. They booked their flights to Los Angeles International Airport instead of San Francisco, which put them 400 miles south of where they needed to be. When they landed in Los Angeles and realized what they had done, they panicked. They tried to rent a car to drive north, but because they were under 25, no rental car company would give them a vehicle. In desperation, they realized they were old enough to rent a U-Haul moving truck. They rented a massive U-Haul and began speeding up the California highway, trying to make it to San Francisco in time for their meeting. But they made another critical error. They entered the wrong address into their GPS, which sent them miles in the wrong direction. By the time they finally arrived at the meeting location in San Francisco, they were hours late. The grant manager was extremely upset and told them to just go back home and wait for a phone call. Back in Maryland, Askia was deeply embarrassed. He confessed to Daniel that they had completely ruined the trip and that they likely would not receive the grant. Askia asked Daniel if he would be willing to invest even more money to help them salvage the app, but Daniel was clearly losing interest in Equity Shark and was hesitant to put any more of his fortune into it. Hoping to stay in Daniel's good graces and prove his worth, Askia offered to do some physical labor for him. He had heard Daniel mention on his live streams that he was looking to expand some of the underground tunnels in his bunker, and Askia offered to do the digging. Daniel was eager to hire him, but he told Askia that because the bunker was a highly classified and secret location, there would be very strict security rules. Daniel explained that he could not allow anyone to know the address of his home because of the imminent threat of a nuclear strike. Askia agreed to all of the rules. On the 28th of January 2017, just after 2 o'clock in the morning, Askia stood outside his house waiting to be picked up. Daniel arrived in a minivan, got out, and handed Askia a pair of heavily modified safety goggles that had been painted completely black so that Askia could not see anything. Daniel then put the goggles on Askia's head, guided him into the passenger seat, and began to drive. Daniel drove in continuous looping circles on the highway and back and forth through various neighborhoods. He wanted to make Askia believe they were traveling to a remote location far away in Virginia, when in reality, they were just driving in circles before heading back to Daniel's house only 15 minutes away. When they pulled into the driveway, Daniel kept the blackout goggles on Askia's face. He tied a string to Askia's wrist and led him like a blind dog out of the van and toward the house. Inside, Daniel carefully guided him through the narrow, cluttered pathways between the massive piles of hoarded trash and papers. They walked all the way to the back of the house, went down the stairs, and entered the basement. In the basement, Daniel had constructed a highly complex maze using chicken wire, stacks of old bicycles, books, and heaps of junk. This maze was specifically designed so that even if a worker came up out of the tunnels, they would be completely disoriented and would not be able to find their way out of the basement without help. Daniel led Askia through this bizarre, dark maze until they reached a gaping hole in the concrete floor. This was the entrance to the underground tunnel system. Only then did Daniel allow Askia to remove his blackout goggles. When Askia looked down into the hole, he was absolutely stunned. He saw a massive, clean, and well-lit network of tunnels stretching out in multiple directions beneath the house. He looked at Daniel in disbelief, asking how far the tunnels actually went, and Daniel proudly told him that the system was enormous. Daniel handed Askia a heavy pickaxe, a shovel, and a hard hat. Then he explained the working conditions. He told Askia that whenever he was down in the tunnels, Daniel would have to place a heavy cover over the entrance hole for security reasons. He also told Askia that because the transport process with the blindfold was so difficult, it would be much easier if Askia simply lived down in the tunnels for several days at a time. Daniel assured him that he would be perfectly comfortable. There was a mattress to sleep on, a strong Wi-Fi connection, plenty of lighting, and a 5-gallon plastic bucket to use as a toilet. Askia was uncomfortable with the idea of living in a hole in the dirt, but he trusted Daniel completely, and he was excited to be working for a millionaire whom he respected so much. So, he agreed. Over the next few months, Askia made the bizarre, blindfolded journey to Daniel's house on a regular basis. He spent days at a time underground, breathing in heavy dirt and dust as he used a pickaxe to carve new paths through the earth. But toward the end of the spring, Askia received the devastating news he had been dreading. Equity Shark had been officially rejected for the $100,000 grant. Askia was completely crushed. He also knew that he now had no way to pay back the $5,000 he owed to Daniel. He asked Daniel if he could increase his hours digging in the tunnels to slowly work off his debt. Daniel agreed. On the 10th of September 2017, Askia was back down in the tunnels. He was working in one of the deepest and lowest sections of the bunker. To reach this area, he had to squeeze his body through a very narrow and tight space. Askia had actually sent a text message to his friends earlier that day, telling them that the tunnel was making him feel incredibly claustrophobic, but he knew he had to keep going to pay off his debt. At around 4 o'clock that afternoon, while Askia was deep in the narrow tunnel, the power suddenly went completely out. Everything fell into a pitch-black silence. Upstairs in the main house, Daniel noticed the power outage. He walked down the stairs into the basement, navigated through his chicken wire maze, and located the main electrical circuit breaker. He flipped the heavy switch, and the power instantly surged back on. But as the power returned, Daniel heard a loud, high-pitched buzzing sound coming from upstairs in the kitchen. He became extremely worried that the sound was being caused by an electrical short circuit that could spark a fire. Instead of checking on Askia first, Daniel immediately reached out and flipped the main circuit breaker back off, plunging Askia back into absolute pitch-black darkness deep underground. Daniel then made his way back through the basement maze, walked up the stairs, and entered the kitchen to find the source of the buzzing sound. But as soon as he stepped into the hallway, he smelled a strong scent of smoke. He turned around and looked back down the basement stairs, and he saw thick, black smoke rapidly billowing up from the basement. Daniel ran back down the stairs and screamed out for Askia. From somewhere deep inside the pitch-black tunnels, he heard Askia's muffled voice yell back, asking what was going on. Daniel screamed for him to get out of there immediately, but the heat and the thick smoke were quickly becoming unbearable. Daniel was forced to run back up the stairs and exit the house to catch his breath in the fresh air. A few moments later, Daniel tried to go back inside. He ran down to the basement stairs, but when he reached the bottom, he did not see Askia. Instead, he saw giant orange flames leaping out of the tunnel entrance. He screamed Askia's name over and over, but there was no response. The heat was too intense, and Daniel had to flee the house. A neighbor saw Daniel standing outside in his yard, screaming hysterically as thick black smoke poured out of the windows of the home. The neighbor immediately called 911. While Daniel was pacing outside, Askia was trapped in a living nightmare. He was deep underground in total darkness. The tunnels were rapidly filling with thick, toxic smoke from the electrical fire. Askia began to crawl desperately through the narrow dirt tunnel, trying to find his way back to the main entrance. Because it was completely dark and his eyes were burning from the smoke, he kept hitting dead ends. But through sheer survival instinct, Askia miraculously managed to find his way back to the main entrance hole. He scrambled out of the hole, gasping for air, only to find himself in a basement that was completely engulfed in flames and thick smoke. This was the moment where Daniel's paranoid security measures became a death sentence. Every single time Askia had been in this basement, he had been wearing blackout goggles. He had absolutely no idea what the layout of the basement looked like. He did not know where the stairs were, and he could not see anything through the dense smoke. He was trapped inside a maze of chicken wire, towering piles of junk, and old bicycles. Desperate to escape the heat, Askia began to scramble over the chicken wire and push past the burning piles of trash. He managed to squeeze past a burning furnace, searching for any sign of an exit. In the distance, through the smoke, he saw a faint glimmer of light. It was a small basement window. Askia rushed toward the window, but as he got closer, his heart sank. Daniel had installed heavy metal security bars over the outside of the window. There was no way to squeeze through them. But Askia refused to give up. In his desperation, he grabbed an old rolling office chair from the clutter, pushed it in front of the window, and climbed on top of it. He used his bare hands to smash the glass pane, hoping he could somehow bypass the bars or scream for help. But the metal bars were set deep into the concrete foundation. They would not budge. After several agonizing minutes of fighting for his life, the toxic smoke overcame him. Askia lost consciousness, fell backward off the chair, and was consumed by the fire. When the fire department finally managed to extinguish the massive blaze, they searched the charred ruins of the basement. They found Askia's body lying directly beneath the small broken window. When investigators first questioned Daniel about why a 19-year-old boy was working in his basement, Daniel tried to downplay the situation. He lied and told the police that the basement was just a cool bachelor pad and that Askia must have simply been asleep down there when the fire started. But as fire investigators began to clear away the debris to find the cause of the fire, they discovered the entrance to the massive underground tunnel system. They were absolutely stunned by the scale of the excavation. As they mapped out the tunnels and examined the basement, they realized the horrific truth of what had happened to Askia. They realized that Daniel had essentially placed Askia into a physical death trap. When the power went out, Askia was trapped deep underground with no light and no way to know that a fire had started. By the time he managed to crawl out of the hole, the basement was already a burning inferno, and because of the chicken wire maze and the piles of hoarded junk, Askia was completely disoriented. The most tragic detail of the investigation was that when Askia was standing on that chair trying to break through the barred window, he was only 2 steps away from a door that led directly to safety. If he had only known which way to turn, he would have lived. But because he had always been blindfolded, he had no idea the door was there. The investigation also revealed that the entire house was a massive fire hazard. Daniel had run dozens of cheap extension cords and heavy-duty power strips from the main house down into the tunnels to power the lights and the Wi-Fi. The electrical system of the old house was simply not built to handle that kind of power load, which is what ultimately triggered the catastrophic electrical fire. Following an intense 8-month investigation, the state prosecutors decided to take action. They charged Daniel Beckwith with involuntary manslaughter, but they also charged him with a much more serious and rare charge in the American legal system. He was charged with second-degree depraved heart murder. This specific charge is used when a person's actions show an utter and complete disregard for the value of human life, to the point where their negligence is so extreme that it is legally treated as an intentional killing. The prosecution argued that by blindfolding Askia, forcing him to work in a dark hole with a blocked exit, and creating a physical maze in a hoarded house, Daniel had created a situation where death was almost inevitable if anything went wrong. They also pointed out that when the power went out, Daniel chose to protect his house from a potential fire by shutting off the breaker, knowingly leaving Askia trapped in the dark while the house burned. During the emotional trial, Askia's parents sat in the courtroom, weeping as they listened to the details of their son's final moments. They described Askia as a loving, ambitious boy who had his whole life ahead of him, but whose trusting nature had been exploited by a paranoid and wealthy man who cared more about his secret bunker than the safety of his workers. Daniel's defense team argued that the fire was a tragic accident and that Daniel had tried to save Askia by running back into the house. But the jury did not agree. They found Daniel guilty of both involuntary manslaughter and second-degree depraved heart murder. He was sentenced to 9 years in state prison. This case left a lasting impact on the quiet community of Bethesda. The massive tunnel system that Daniel spent years and hundreds of thousands of dollars to dig was eventually filled in with concrete by the city to prevent the surrounding homes from collapsing. Today, the property stands empty, a quiet and eerie reminder of a young man's brilliant mind that was completely destroyed by paranoia, and a tragic young victim who simply wanted to build a better life for himself, but ended up trapped in a nightmare. A young man trusted the wrong person, walked into a hidden underground world, and never made it back out. It's one of the strangest and most tragic cases in recent memory. If you want another true story that's just as unbelievable, click the next video on your screen right now. Sometimes the most frightening stories are not the ones about monsters hiding in the dark or shadowy figures in the woods. They are the stories that start in the most ordinary of places. A radio station, a military ship, a county jail. They involve regular people making what seem like small decisions, but those decisions create ripples that spiral into something truly unbelievable and often tragic. Today we're looking at 3 stories where a simple choice, a fun contest, and a routine arrest went horribly wrong. One is a story of incredible laziness, another of a game that turned deadly, and the last is a story of a man being completely forgotten by the world. To do this first story justice, it has to be told in the first person. So just know, for this part, I am simply an actor relaying someone else's experience. I was on a U.S. military ship sitting in the wardroom. The wardroom is basically the officer's lounge, a place to grab a coffee or a bite to eat. It was early morning, and the operations officer came stumbling in. This guy was the absolute definition of not a morning person. He was bleary-eyed, moving like a zombie, and clutching a bagel in his hand. He sits down at the table directly across from me, barely conscious, and starts gnawing on his breakfast. I was sitting with my back to the outboard side of the ship, which is the outside wall. Right next to my head was a porthole, and the morning sun was beaming through it. The light cut right across the room and was hitting this officer directly in his face. He's squinting, trying to block the sun with his hand, looking totally miserable. I'm just watching him, expecting him to do the logical thing and just shift his chair a few inches to the left or right to get out of the sun's path. But he doesn't. Instead, this officer slowly, and I mean slowly, reaches for the phone that was mounted on the wall. He picks up the receiver, brings it to his ear, and in a groggy voice he says, "Yeah, bridge." Yeah, this is Ops. "I need you to adjust our path." He pauses for a second. "Yeah, 156. Yep, that's about right." "Okay. All right, bye." He hangs up the phone and just sits there. He hasn't moved an inch. He's still squinting, looking up at the sunlight that's blazing on his face. I'm looking back and forth between him and the porthole, trying to figure out what just happened. And then I see it. The circle of light from the porthole gradually begins to shift off of him. It moves across the table, onto the wall behind him, and then it just stops. By ordering the bridge to change the ship's course by about 15 degrees, he had changed the ship's position just enough to move the sun off his face. He literally redirected thousands of tons of steel and a crew of hundreds of people just because he was too lazy to move his chair. I was in total awe. I couldn't believe what I had just witnessed. For a second, I worried that the sheer, unbelievable brilliance of this move was lost on him in his tired state. But then, as I'm just staring at him, he takes a bite of his bagel, looks up at me, and gives me a little smile before going right back to his breakfast. In November of 2006, Nintendo released a brand new gaming console. It was called the Wii, and it was an absolute sensation. It was so popular that it sold out almost completely right away. By January of the next year, you still couldn't find one on the shelves in most places around the world. People were going crazy, spending unbelievable amounts of money online just to get their hands on one. A radio station in Sacramento, California called KDND managed to get a hold of one of these coveted systems. They decided they would give it away as a prize in an on-air contest. The contest had a catchy, if a bit silly, name. It was called Hold Your Wii for a Wii. The premise was simple. Contestants would be given lots and lots of water to drink. The person who could hold it the longest, meaning they didn't go to the bathroom to urinate, would win the brand new Nintendo Wii. In the days leading up to the contest, the radio station promoted it very aggressively on the air. As they did, lots of concerned listeners started calling in. They warned the station that drinking too much water too quickly can actually be deadly, but the station just brushed these concerns off. The on-air personalities said they were aware of the risks and that all the contestants would be signing a waiver. This waiver, they claimed, meant the station was not responsible for whatever happened to them. On the morning of Friday, January 12th, 18 contestants showed up at the KDND radio station. They were all led into a room and handed their waivers to sign. One contestant later said the waiver only seemed to cover publicity issues, not anything about health and safety. One of the people there that day was a 28-year-old woman named Jennifer Strange. Jennifer was a mother of 3, and she was there trying to win this Wii for her kids. She, along with everyone else, signed the paper and was then ushered into the contest room. The rules were laid out. They were each handed an 8-ounce bottle of water. Every 15 minutes, they were expected to finish that water bottle. If they couldn't finish it in time, or if they got up to use the bathroom at any point, they were out of the contest. The contest officially started at 6:45 a.m. By 8 a.m., after 5 bottles of water had been consumed, a number of contestants had already pulled themselves out of the game to use the bathroom. The radio staff, however, felt like the contest was moving too slowly. So, to speed things up, they gave the remaining contestants, including Jennifer, a larger bottle of water to drink from. Over the next several hours, all of the contestants, except for Jennifer and one other person, had dropped out. The pain was just too much. They had to go to the bathroom. Jennifer was heard on the air, her voice strained, saying that it hurt so much. One of the radio hosts just laughed and said, "Well, do you need to lay down?" Then someone else piped up and said, "She can't even walk." And the room just filled with laughter, and nobody did anything. Around this time, a nurse who was listening to the broadcast called into the station. She very emphatically told them that what they were doing was a really, really bad idea. She said, "You're going to get someone killed from water intoxication." Water intoxication, also known as water poisoning, is a very real and dangerous condition. In a nutshell, when you drink way too much water in a short period of time, it dilutes the sodium levels in your bloodstream. This can cause your cells, including your brain cells, to swell up. This swelling can lead to comas, seizures, and even death. The host, after hearing this nurse's very serious concern, just turned away from the phone and yelled to the contestants, "Hey, is anybody dying out there?" Then he just laughed and hung up on the nurse. A little while later, you can hear one of the hosts on the broadcast commenting on how Jennifer's belly looked really strange. It had become totally distended and bloated. They joked that it looked like she was pregnant. At some point, both Jennifer and the other remaining contestant started vomiting. But instead of dropping out of the contest, they just continued to drink more water, determined not to go to the bathroom. But finally, the pain became too much for Jennifer to bear. She dropped out of the contest, and she finally relieved herself. For coming in second place, she was given tickets to a Justin Timberlake concert. On her drive home from the radio station, Jennifer began experiencing a horrific headache. It was so bad that she was just sobbing uncontrollably. Through her tears, she called one of her coworkers and told her she wasn't going to be able to make it into work that day. Her head just hurt too much. After she hung up, the coworker she had just spoken to was really concerned about her. She decided to call Jennifer's mother to let her know what was going on. About an hour later, Jennifer's mother headed over to Jennifer's house to check on her. When she got there, she found Jennifer dead in her bathroom. She had died from water poisoning. The station was ultimately sued by Jennifer's family. A jury found the station was negligent, and they were ordered to pay over $16 million in damages. In 2005, a 57-year-old man named Stephen Slevin was physically a healthy man, but mentally he was really struggling. He was depressed and felt like his life didn't have any purpose anymore. So, in August of that year, he decided to just get in his car and go on a road trip. He didn't have a destination. He just felt like if he could get out on the open road and just go somewhere, anywhere, he might start to feel better. On this road trip, he eventually began drinking alcohol. Before long, he was swerving along a New Mexico highway. A police officer saw his erratic driving and pulled him over. Once Stephen failed his sobriety test, the police officer arrested him for a DWI. Stephen was brought to a local detention center. During his booking process, it was discovered that he had a history of mental illness. So the officers, following that county's policy, decided to segregate him from the rest of the general population. In an effort to protect Stephen from himself, they moved him into a padded cell on the first floor. They removed all of his clothing and put him in what's called a suicide smock. It looks kind of like a big, thick blanket that's wrapped around your upper body. It keeps inmates warm and modest, but it also prevents them from being able to ball up their clothes to create a noose they could hurt themselves with. After a few days in this padded cell, Stephen was moved to a better cell. This one had a window, a shower, and a toilet. He was kept there for 2 weeks under strict medical observation. But at the end of those 2 weeks, for reasons that are still not entirely clear, Stephen, this mentally unstable man, was moved into solitary confinement to await his trial for the DWI. Solitary confinement is a type of imprisonment where an inmate is put into a single-person cell and they are kept there nearly around the clock, without any significant human interaction. The psychological effects of solitary confinement are well documented and they are terrifying. Just 15 days in solitary can be enough to cause permanent psychological damage. Stephen's first few weeks in solitary were actually okay. He was allowed to write to his family, and he was able to detox and reflect on his life. During those first few weeks, It was noted in the records that Stephen was very polite in his very limited interactions with the officers who were dropping food off through the slot in his door. Also, when Stephen had a few minor medical issues, instead of throwing a fit, he would just knock on the inside of his door and wait patiently for someone to acknowledge him. This often took a long time, but he never got frustrated or angry. But by January of 2006, so roughly 3 months into his solitary stint, Stephen had not received any updates on when his case was going to go to trial. And he was starting to lose his grip on reality. He was having these severe panic attacks, and he was suffering from intense hallucinations. He desperately wanted to find out how much longer he was going to be kept in that cell, but nobody would tell him anything. He tried writing letters to his family, asking them for help, or asking them to try to get an update on his case. But when he went to actually write the letters, his hands would shake so severely from the stress and anxiety that he literally could not write. Starting that January, Stephen began spending the bulk of his day huddled in the corner of his cell with his knees tucked up to his chest, just rocking back and forth. He was supposed to be allowed out of his cell a few times a month, but in April of that year, that stopped. He almost never left his cell again. And without ever leaving his cell, Stephen was unable to bathe. His skin began to develop a fungus and started to fall off in patches. His fingernails grew long and curled. His teeth began to rot. Finally, on the 8th of May 2007, after 1 year and 8 months of being in solitary confinement, Stephen was transferred out of his cell to a behavioral institute in Las Vegas, Nevada. After bathing and shaving and getting his hair cut and receiving proper medical treatment, he was back to his normal self within a couple of days. While he was there, he had a chance to speak to a lawyer. The lawyer would later say that during their entire meeting, Stephen just kept asking, "Where have I been?" The lawyer explained to him, "You've been in solitary confinement, awaiting trial. You've been there for almost 2 years." Stephen was shocked. He literally didn't believe him. He actually couldn't remember that huge chunk of his life. It was as if his mind, to protect itself, had completely repressed the trauma. But as the lawyer told him more about it, it began to come back to him in flashes. He begged the lawyer to not let them send him back to that solitary confinement cell. The lawyer said, "Unfortunately, if that's where they decide to keep you, that's where you'll be until you have your trial. And we have no idea when that trial is going to be. But stay strong. It's bound to be soon." Stephen stayed at the Institute for 2 weeks. During that time, he asked constantly about when his trial was going to happen, but nobody knew. And at the end of those 2 weeks, Stephen was abruptly taken from his room, put in a van, driven back to New Mexico, and put right back into his solitary confinement cell. Immediately, Stephen began to deteriorate again. He begged the guards not to put him back in there, but nobody was listening. And before long, the heavy steel door had shut, and he was all alone again. Within a couple of days, Stephen developed a painful abscess in one of his teeth. He tried to get medical attention, but he was ignored. So he sat in the corner of his cell, and for 8 straight hours one day, he rocked back and forth and violently twisted and yanked and pulled on that infected tooth until he was able to rip it out of his own head. Almost 2 months later, on the 22nd of June 2007, Stephen's case was finally put before a judge. The judge immediately dismissed all of the charges against him. It's believed the judge had found out about the horrible mistreatment Stephen had endured and took pity on him, but we will never know for sure. 3 days later, Stephen was released from jail and reunited with his family. He had been in solitary confinement for 2 years without so much as a single hearing to tell him what was going on with his case. He had essentially been completely forgotten about. He would go on to sue the county, and he won $15.5 million in damages. However, at the same time he was winning this case, he was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer and given less than a year to live. It is unclear if he is still alive today. 3 completely different stories, but they all show how fragile our own worlds can be. how a moment of extreme laziness, a terrible lapse in judgment during a contest, or a crack in the system that's supposed to protect us can change everything forever. It's a haunting reminder that sometimes the real horror isn't some external force, but the devastating consequences of very human decisions. 3 stories. 3 ordinary places. 3 decisions that never should have mattered until they did. Because what makes these stories unsettling isn't just what happened, it's how easily it all began. A small choice. A moment of carelessness. A system that didn't react in time. And suddenly, everything changed. Until next time.